You would like to know where I was born, a little bit my background. I was born in a small town not far from Lodz, but we lived in Lodz, but my parents somehow went to visit their grandparents. My grandparents, I was born in a small town called Vloshcheva, but I lived my life in Lodz all my life. And I went to the Cheder in Lodz, a very famous Cheder called Darkei Noam. And surprisingly, we used to have secular studies also in that Cheder. It was a very nice, very popular school, and was one of what I will call one of the middle-class schools in a higher class, because the fact that we even went to high school in that particular school those days. So I was really brought up in Lodz, and after the Cheder I learned in Gerish Stiebel for a while, and then the war broke out September 1st, 1939. So at that time Poland was split into two parts. The Germans occupied the western part, and the Russians occupied the eastern part. So at the beginning, while we lived in Lodz, the Germans came in very quickly. It just took a few days. They walked in, and there was no fighting, unfortunately, because the town of Lodz was a big town, about 750,000 people, and they say there were about 100,000 of the Polish citizens, which really originally they came from Germany. So they welcomed the German army with open arms, with flowers. So for a while there was a quiet. We didn't realize, nobody expected it's going to happen, what finally happened. So we couldn't really live a normal life because they closed down the schools, they closed down the shuls. But more or less we lived with difficulty, but we somehow managed to exist. However, a lot of us decided to go and cross the river, which separated the German part from the Russians, because we knew under the Russian occupation at least the life is secured, but Yiddishkeit would be a problem. So anyway, I got a letter. My sister actually got a letter from a friend of hers that she was on the other side, on the Russian side, and she suggested that we come over to the Russian side. At least we'll know we'll be able to live in peace. Since my sister was older than I was, about 4 or 5 years older, my father decided that it's not proper and it's not safe to send a girl across the border alone. So we decided I will go alone, because the same day the Germans took us to work, and I was working for them for a day and came back. They beat us, and we had some problems with the occupation at the time already. So we decided, let me go to the Russian side, and I'll come back and let you know. I'll let my parents know whether we should continue or not. The end was, of course, I had no more communications with them. It was very difficult to communicate at the time. And I managed somehow through it wasn't easy. We had to cross a river, and it was dangerous to cross that river. And finally, when we arrived on the Russian side, the Russians kept all those so-called refugees to put us in a special building, and most of them were sent back to the German side. That was the agreement between the Russians and the German. And finally, I managed to escape, and I came to a town called Bialystok. When I arrived into this town, I didn't know anyone. I met a friend, Ager Chosid, that I knew from before, and he advised me to go with him, and we went to a shul. We all lived and slept in a shul. There was no place, no hotels to sleep in. And then at that time I met a group of Lubavitcher Hasidim, Lubavitcher Bochim. They also came to the Russian side from Poland. They had a yeshiva in Notvotsk, a Chabad yeshiva, and they decided, or they knew, that Vilna, the town of Vilna, was occupied by the Lithuanians. At the same time as the Russians and the Germans occupied Poland, somehow they made an agreement to give the town of Vilna back to the Lithuanians. So actually Vilna was a city that was not occupied by anyone, was a free city, and people could live peacefully. So they heard that the Mir Yeshiva and other yeshivas have gone to Vilna, and they decided we will also go to Vilna. By the time we decided to go was about December already in 1939. The border between Poland and Lithuania was closed. So again, we had to smuggle through the border to go to Vilna. It was a very difficult ordeal. We were caught several times and sent back and forth. Finally, we managed to get to Vilna. Coming to Vilna alone, I was a young boy at the time, maybe about 15 years old or so, and we didn't know what to do, so I heard that Yeshivas Chachma Lublin opened up a yeshiva, because the Rosh Yeshivas at the time, they went to Rab Chaim Moiser to ask what to do, and Rab Chaim Moiser, Chaim Moiser Grudziński, who was the head, of course, of Vada Yeshivas in Poland, and the head of Vilna, Vada Rabbonim now. So he suggested that they should open a Yeshivas Chachma Lublin in Vilna. So I got together about 40 boys, 30, 40 Talmidim, with a very choshev Rosh Yeshivas, Rav Hirschsprung from Montreal, Rav Hirschberg, who later on became the head of the Rosh Bezin in Mexico City, Rav Moshe Rottenberg from Detroit, who was, of course, Rosh Yeshiva and Yeshivas Chachma Lublin in Detroit, and many others, Yehuda Lubat, Mamish Gedolim Ador, because in those days, most of them wrote Sforim already in Kochim. It was a very big surprise, Achshavas HaKodesh and all. And the Rosh Yeshiva was Rav Eisenstadt. He was the son-in-law of the Kokev Rov, and very choshev Rabbonim. So the end was we started Yeshivas Chachma Lublin. But it was very difficult to live on the few dollars that somehow the yeshiva collected from overseas or from the local population. It was very hard. In fact, I remember Shabbos, Hirschberg used to go to the shuls and make a little speech, and I walk around with him and collect a piece of bread, a piece of challah, came back to yeshiva, and that's what we ate. It was very, very difficult. So eventually, around Pesach time, they decided I'll be much better off if they will send me to a regular yeshiva, and they sent me to the Telz yeshiva. So I went to Telz. I was very fortunate to be there from Pesach until the following Hanukkah, because after all, the yeshiva, Telz yeshiva, was organized and well-known, one of the best yeshivas and most known in the world, actually. And I stayed there and learned, and things looked pretty normal, so to speak. But what happened in about 3-4 months later, in August of 1940, the Russians decided to reoccupy Lithuania, and again they came to Telz Yeshiva, and they didn't destroy the yeshiva, but they occupied the yeshiva for themselves, and the yeshiva had no place where to go, so that was moved into the shul, the local shul. But nevertheless, we lived there for a while, and somehow we managed, at least physically, we were not endangered. About that time, there was a man in the Telz Yeshiva. His name was Nathan Gutwood. He was a Dutch citizen. He was born in Holland, and he learned in Telz Yeshiva. And he went to the Dutch consulate.
Wasn't he a boy still?
He was a boy.
So you said he was a man. Could you just say that over again?
Okay.
Okay, we're fine anytime. Go ahead.
Well, around that time, there was a Talmud in Telz Yeshiva. His name was Nathan Gutwood. He was born in Holland, so he was a Dutch citizen. He went to the Dutch consul asking him how he can leave the European continent and go somewhere far away so he wouldn't be endangered with the occupation of the Russian occupation. He wanted to leave Lithuania. And the Dutch consul told him that there was a place called Curacao, which is near Venezuela. At that time, it belonged to the Dutch, to the Holland government. And he could go to Curacao. He doesn't even need a visa, because one may go to the country without applying for a visa. Nevertheless, anyway, he was a Dutch citizen, so he didn't have a problem. So he gave him this visa. And he wrote down on his passport to say that one does not require a visa to go to Curacao. Finally, he went to the Japanese consul, Mr. Sugahara, and told him that he wants to go to Curacao, but the Atlantic was already occupied and was very dangerous to go with the German war. And so the only way he can go to Curacao will be through the Pacific, because at that time the Pacific was calm. There was no war between the Japanese and the United States. So he asked for a transit visa to go through Japan, and Mr. Sugahara gave him a transit visa to go to Japan for the purpose of continuing to Curacao. Then finally he had to go to the Russian government, ask permission to leave Russia. This was called an exit visa from Russia. And he went to the Russian government and he got this exit visa, realizing that it's possible for many people to get that visa to go to Curacao, since one does not require a visa. He told some of his friends, and there were other people who found out about this situation. There was Dr. Yitzhak Levine, who was the head of Agudas Yisrael, and his son is Nat Levine, a very famous lawyer in Washington. His wife was also a Dutch citizen, and he too got the visa. In fact, perhaps he must have gotten the visa before even Mr. Goodwood. In any case, he got the visa, and they told to the yeshivas that one can acquire a visa to get out from Lithuania, through Russia, through Japan, to a place called Curacao. So the Mira Yeshiva, the entire Mira Yeshiva, and some of other yeshivas went to the Japanese consul. First they went to the Dutch consul, and they received the visa to Curacao, and then they went to the Japanese consul, Mr. Sugahara, to get a visa. But in the meantime, he realized that this is not a one or two kind of persons per visas. They came en masse. They came hundreds of people, and also other organizations, some organizations, also Mr. Wahrhaftig from Mizrahi, he found out, and so hundreds and hundreds of people, up to thousands, came for visas. So he asked the Japanese government in Tokyo what he should do, and they absolutely refused to give him permission to give the visas. Nevertheless, he was a good man, and he decided and worked day and night with the help of some of the Talmidim from the Mira Yeshiva. They came in to help him out to issue those visas, and gave the visas. But of course, the whole thing took only 2 or 3 weeks. In the meantime, the Dutch consul closed down because the Russians notified the Dutch consul as well as the Japanese consul that they have to close, because since they occupied Lithuania, so the main ambassador should be in Moscow. So they closed them down. So the whole thing took only about 2 or 3 weeks to get those visas. In fact, the Japanese visas, he issued 2,139 visas, and my visa is about 2,120, or mamish the last minute. Perhaps 10 or 20 names before. I have a list, by the way, of the 2,139. I can see my name on the last page. Another problem was, by the time we found out, speaking about me personally, by the time we found out that we can get a Curacao visa, was too late already. The Dutch consul had already left Vilna, and so nevertheless, the Japanese was very nice, Mr. Sugahara. He issued transit visas, even though we didn't have what we call an end visa to travel to. I was, as I mentioned before, a Talmud in Tel Yeshiva, so I really didn't know much what was going on. But in the meantime, since I learned about 6 months in Yeshivas Chachma Lublin, the Amsterdam Rebbe was in charge of this yeshiva. He was the head, the spiritual head, the rochnistic head of the yeshiva, and he took a visas for the entire Yeshivas Chachma Lublin, and he put my name also on that paper, on the list of the Talmidim. So fortunately, I got also the Japanese visa. Even though I had sent someone to try to get the visa, but he never did. Unfortunately, I found out that Zechor Yemos, he put my name on an Yeshivas Chachmal Blin visa, and I got a Japanese visa. As I mentioned before, I never received the Dutch visa, the Curacao visa. The reason I'm mentioning because of an incident what happened later on. And then finally we applied for visas going through, the exit visas through the Russians. They gave us the visa. That too was extremely dangerous. I must point out to you what happened. 6 months earlier, the Russian government had notified all the Jews or anyone who wants to leave the country, they can leave. And many people have applied. Finally, what happened around May or June 1940, the Russians came to the Russian side, occupied Poland, well, the side that Poland was occupied by the Russians, and they took approximately 200,000 Jews on trains and sent them away to, supposedly to Siberia. At that time was was a disaster. People were so concerned, so worried about this particular problem. In fact, my wife was only 2 years old, and her father was killed by the Germans, and her mother was taken away with a 2-year-old baby and a 6-year-old boy and sent away to Siberia. Little did we realize that there was a Yad Hashem to save these people, because 99.9% survived. All these Jews who were sent away to Siberia or to Tashkent or to Georgia, to all these places on the Russian side, Baruch Hashem survived, including the Chibinarov and so many others. And well, I can mention a lot of names, but many Gdolei Hador later on that came to Eretz Yisrael, like Rav Schneizon, the Rosh Yeshiva tells us of the Chibin Rosh Yeshiva, and so many Gdolim. He was also, by the way, Talmud of Shivas Chacham Lublin. So they all survived. However, for us to apply for a visa to go for an exit visa from Russia to continue to Japan, supposedly telling the Russian government that we would like to leave their Gan Eden, that was extremely dangerous. And this is one of the answers that we always we bothered. We can't understand why so few, only 2,100 people left the Russian occupation, only the Mir Yeshiva and others. Why not thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands? But we have to realize at the time was a big cholika deis. We didn't know whether one should apply for exit visa to Russia, because they said, why, you don't like us, we're not good for you. And the first thing they'll do, they send you to Siberia, which at that time was mamish pikuach nefesh. So that was one of the reasons not many of Rosh Yeshivas agreed to obtain those visas. Somehow, the Mir Yeshiva, Baruch Hashem, and some others from the Kletzke Yeshiva, Kamenetz Yeshiva, Rabar Zechor Yemos, he got the visa also at that time to go through Japan. So they decided they will take that chance, and Baruch Hashem, of course, they were saved this way. And finally, we got the visa. The question was how to pay to the Russian government for the train and for the ship that will take us from Russia to Japan. And the Russian government insisted at the time that we have to pay in US dollars, about $180 per person, which was, at the time, was a lot of money for those who didn't have it. Fortunately, the Mir Yeshiva had an office here, Rav Kalmanovich, and also Vadatzula was working over here. So they received money to pay for the fare, for the ticket. But some of us who had no connection, especially the Yeshivas Chacham Lublin, Talmidim, Yeshivas Chacham Lublin, they had no money, no way to get $180. So they had to go by train from town to town and pay in local currency. That alone was very dangerous, was illegal to do this. But that's another story, because when we arrived to Moscow, and we wanted to get a ticket from Moscow to Vladivostok, and we asked for a ticket at the station at the at the station, at the train station, they will not sell us. They told us to go to the official government called InTourist to get it. And over there they asked only dollars, and it was impossible for us to get the $180. Finally, we found a way. We found a Russian soldier, and we asked him as a favor to go and buy a ticket because he was a Russian army, so he didn't have to pay foreign dollars in dollars, and the station didn't know, so they sold him the ticket for something like $2, $3, and he bought a couple of tickets. Anyway, this is how we managed to get on the train to go from Russia. The train was in 11 days, to go from Moscow to Vladivostok. And then we arrived in Vladivostok. The problem was, which was the eastern part of Russia, the last port, we had to get a ship going from Vladivostok to Japan. But most of the spaces was all reserved by those people who paid $180. So it was very difficult. It was a small little dingy little boat, and it must have taken, perhaps they would take 200-300 people or 150 people at a time. It was very difficult to get space. Unfortunately, finally we got the space. I would like to tell you a story of what happened. Since when we arrived to Japan, and the immigration officer looked at our visa, transit visa going through Japan to work. We had no final visa. We didn't have the end visa going to Curacao. It was too late for us to get. So he would not let us land. And 72 of us were sent back on the same boat, back from Japan, back to Russia. You can imagine our hearts. We were sure that once we come back to Russia, that those days the NKVD, which is the FBI of Russia, they certainly will arrest us and send us to Siberia. They came on the ship and they saw that 72 people, and we didn't speak Russian, and we were quiet. We made believe we sleep, actually. And one person spoke Russian, and they said, "What are you doing over here?" Can you imagine 1941, under Stalin, 72 people come to a country without a visa? You remember, you know the story of the St. Louis, where 800 Jews came to the United States and to Cuba, and the American government would not let them land over here. And most of them perished never. Just imagine to come back, 72 people to the communist country in 1941 without a visa, without any papers. And the government, the FBI people, I call them FBI, but actually the NKVD, they said, "What are you doing over here? How many spies are you? Who sent you over here?" And it was so dangerous, and we were saying till him for 2 days. Finally, they wouldn't let us land. And fortunately, the ship went back to Japan. In the meantime, the Jewish community over there went to the Dutch consul in Japan, to the ambassador, and asked for a visa to Curacao for all 72 of us. And he graciously gave this paper. In fact, I have a copy. It was found in the National Archives in Washington and was sent to me by the son of Mr. David, who was the ambassador originally in Kovno. He told me the story, and he sent me a copy. I have a copy of the 72, a list of all the visas given to us. I don't know why that paper ended up in the National Archives in Washington. That's another story, why the ambassador will send that information in 1941 to Washington. But finally, so we came back after twice we going back and forth, we landed in Japan.
I want to interrupt for a second. One detail you didn't tell us is, did you have a Polish passport? How did you get a visa altogether without a passport? What did you do for
I'm
that?
going to cover that. Good you asked me. Well, actually, when we arrived, it's an interesting story because none of us had any passports. Because when I left Lodge, I had nothing. The only thing I had is a pair of tefillin. And when we traveled, there was no, before the war, young boys, Polish or whatever, whoever it was, nobody, it just wasn't so well organized like nowadays. Everybody has a passport. So in reality, nobody had anything. But when we arrived to Vilna, at that time, when Lithuania occupied Vilna, there was a Polish ambassador in Kovno. And we applied to the Polish ambassador to give us a paper, at least identification paper. And they did give us. So they gave us a piece of paper to show that our names, when we were born, and so we are Polish citizens. Based on that paper, we got the visa. But some of us didn't even have that paper. Some of us, when the Japanese consul, Mr. Sugihara, issued a visa, he issued even on a plain piece of paper. In fact, what happened after Mr. Sugihara left, it's another interesting story. Mr. Sugihara left, there were no more visas obtainable. Some artists in Vilna, they knew how to copy the visa. So they made a stamp, because it's all written in Japanese, and they copied. Based on that stamp and that so-called false visa, they applied to the Russian government for exit visa. And some of my friends, they live in Los Angeles, the Hendelis family, two brothers, they both passed away already, and they both had that false visa. They never had a visa. So the funny part was that when they arrived in Japan, in Tsuruga was a port, in the Japanese immigration authorities, they look at the paper, they turn it backwards, forwards, they can't understand it. It didn't look like Japanese at all. It was, just imagine somebody arriving in Tel Aviv at the airport and has a false immigration business, Medinat Yisrael, a visa in Hebrew, written in Hebrew, which was copied by some guy. So that's another story. In fact, it's a long story what happened to them. Finally, also, they let them down. They let them down because they interviewed through the Curaçao. They got a visa to Curaçao, the Japanese let them down. So at the end, finally, we landed in Japan. And when we came to Japan, was mamish mafaila lo'oiro, coming from the communist country, from suffering, nothing to eat, 11 days train with mamish, nothing to eat, just a piece of bread. We had to stop every day or so to get a piece of bread and a little hot water. And we came to Japan. It was a beautiful country. It's like the sunshine, fruits available. Everything was so beautiful. But there was no place where to live. About 2,000 people arrived more or less in 2 or 3 months. There were no hotels at the time. And even if there were, who could pay the fee for them? But the Jewish community in Tokyo was very gracious. They put us up in houses.
Jewish community in Tokyo?
Jewish community in Kobe, Jewish community in Kobe were very gracious, and they also got help from the Japanese government somehow, and they rented houses, and they spread all over the town in Kobe. So each house could accommodate 20, 30 people, because usually the Japanese houses were single little houses built very small. There were no high rises at the time. And so we lived in Japan. And then life started. At least we were free. And the government, or somehow maybe perhaps the joint, whoever, I don't really know exactly. I was too young to get involved in the financial angle of it. So we got paid about a yen a day, about 25 cents a day. The bread in Japan was not really made of wheat, it was made of rice flour. Anyway, the bottom line is we managed to live. We were very happy living in Japan. The problem in Japan, there are several problems. Problem number one, where do we go from there? Number two is we had a problem, the yeshivas, where to learn and where to daven. There was a shul over there. Fortunately, there was a shul with a chazan even. Now came the problem of Shabbos. And Shabbos, as you know, it was a difference of opinion between Chazon Ish and the others. Some people kept Shabbos, and others kept Sunday Shabbos. And those who kept Shabbos, then they kept Sunday only Isur D'Oraisa. They didn't do anything with D'Oraisa. Midrabanan, they will do certain things. But on the other hand, those who kept Sunday Shabbos, they put on tefillin. They will put on tefillin on our Shabbos. So it was a problem. Well, we made Kiddush Friday night. They made Kiddush Motzei Shabbos. We made Havdalah. They made Kiddush. So I'm not going into this problem. It's a very serious discussion based on the Balamor and Rosh Hashanah Davchov. So it was not easy. It was There was a problem between the Rosh Yeshivas, and those who followed one just followed whoever the Rosh Yeshiva told them to do. And those, basically the Hasidic group, Lubavitch and Yeshivas Chacham Lublin and many others, they followed what we got information, we got instructions and advice from Eretz Yisrael. It was after Kaczynski at the time, Herzog and Rabboni Sarushis, and also the Ger Rebbe and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They told us to keep Shabbos. And Sunday we should machmer sein, Sunday we should keep the Reisa. However, we put on tefillin on Sunday. Anyway, this was one problem. Second problem, Pesach came along. So Pesach also problem with matzahs. Naturally, there was no question of having hen matzahs. So we were lucky to get some matzahs, came from somewhere. I heard it came from the United States. And some of them were baked matzahs. It was another problem, whether we should eat, some kidneys or rice. And at that time, there was some of the Rabbonim and Michael Givain, we should use it. But the most important thing, we were free, we were very, very happy. And everyone tried to find a way how eventually to emigrate to some place, mostly to either to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel, or to go to the United States. But what happened about 3-4 months later, around August 1941, we have to realize that a few months earlier, on June 22, 1941, the Germans attacked the Russians. So it became another war in Europe between the Russians and the Germans. So the whole world was already in turmoil, especially the Japanese were at the time the axis of the Germans. And so they had a lot of pressure from the German government to do something about the Jews in Japan. At the end, what happened, sometimes in August, around Tisha B'Av time, we got advice from the government, from the Japanese government, that all foreigners have to leave Japan and go to Shanghai. At the time, we didn't quite realize that Shanghai was a very beautiful town, a good town, metropolitan, big town, and would be much easier for us. But at the time, it was difficult. We didn't realize where we were going to, and everyone was sent away from Japan to Shanghai, which, by the way, for Shabbos was much easier because there was no problem about Shabbos in Shanghai. So later on, nowadays, in retrospect, when we look back, we realize that in August 1941, the Japanese perhaps were preparing for Pearl Harbor 3 months later, in December 7th and December 8th. So maybe if they didn't want foreigners to stay around in Kobe in Japan, which was a port, one of the major ports in Japan, to see how the Japanese government is preparing for future Pearl Harbor. But it's just a conjecture on my part. But the end is, we all had to leave. In a way, it was good. We didn't have the problem for Shabbos, and we arrived in Shanghai. We came to Shanghai. That was a different story altogether.
Can you take a minute and tell us,
please,
what Shanghai?
And anytime.
So we finally we were sent on ships, big ships, and we arrived in Shanghai. Just on a side note, what happened? We were on the ship. We were on Shabbos. We traveled on the ship. So I remember that at the time was a problem about carrying on the ship on Shabbos. So the story was told that I was there at the time. So we sent somebody over to the captain of the Japanese ship, asking him if he would be willing to sell the ship. We have to buy the ship in order to be able to carry Shabbos. You can imagine, tell the captain of a Japanese ship that we want to buy the ship from him. Anyway, we arrived in Shanghai. Now, Shanghai at the time was an international city. And I think sometimes of Meshav Chachumim Mocher, how little we knew the world at the time, how little the European countries knew what's happening in the rest of the world. Do you realize that Shanghai was an open city, international city? Anybody could have come to Shanghai without a visa. And because Shanghai was at the time divided among different sections, the British, the English had occupied a section. They managed everything in English. The police were in English. The post office was controlled, and banks were controlled by the British. The French had their own concession. The police looked and dressed and spoke in French. Everything was in French. The Germans had a concession. The Japanese had a concession. When I mean concession, I mean a section. Like you can't imagine, was a big, beautiful town. And why we didn't understand from in Europe, that as soon as the Germans came in, why didn't we come to Shanghai? Perhaps a few 100,000 people. It was so easy to go there, either by train or by ship. So I'll give you a little background of Shanghai, which reminds me of the time of Beis Hamikdash. You know, there was infrastructure in Shanghai already. The Benjamin settled, made Shanghai preparing for us at the time in several ways. First of all, about 100 years earlier, there was a Sephardi community that came from Iraq, and they were very wealthy, the richest people in Shanghai. They owned the electric and the gas station, and also occupied the stock exchange. The names, various famous names, Sassoon, Khaldun, and Abrahams, and it was a big, beautiful Jewish community, about 1,000 families living in Shanghai in the French or in the English concession, English section. That's number one. Number two, there was a big Russian community, also 1,000 Russians. They came here before the Russian Revolution, before 1917, even during the Japanese and Russian War, 1905. And they had Rav Ashkenazi, was a great Talmud Chochem, was a Chabad, was from Lubavitcher. Had a beautiful family himself, and was a beautiful shul, mikvahs, and Talmud Torah, and everything was there. So these are the two groups of people. But coming closer to my time, in 1937, 2-3 years before the war, the Germans threw out almost 20,000 people who lived in Jewish people who lived in Germany with Polish passports. They were considered foreigners. And when Hitler came to power, he asked all those Jewish people, particularly Jewish people, I don't know, perhaps others too, they have to leave Germany. And they send them over to a border town called Zbonchin between Germany and Poland. The Polish government would not let the Jews in, and the German government threw them out. And those people, almost 20,000, left that part of the world with suitcases, with their clothing, with their jewelry, whatever they wanted to take, they could have taken, and they left on ships going to Shanghai. And over 20,000 of the German Jews came to Shanghai during 1937-38, just before we came. And they too prepared a place for us. I don't know, can't tell you the exact percentage how many were religious or not, but there was a religious community too, with a rabbi, with a moil, and sort of a little, they had a Beisakov, a little school, a religious school. But most were professionals, were doctors and lawyers and anything you can possibly think of. And they came to Shanghai. Unfortunately, that group, either they were not allowed to, or perhaps they didn't have enough money, and they settled in a section called Hongqiu, the poorer section of Shanghai, the very extremely poor section of Shanghai. So in fact, when we arrived, we had 3 communities in Shanghai. 2 of them, wealthy community, the Russian and the Sephardi community, and about 20,000 Yidden, Stam Yidden, Jewish people. And we came to Shanghai. We didn't have, either we didn't have enough money or whatever the reason was. Everyone settled down in the Hongqiu section. In the Hongqiu means in that German, the German Chinese section, the poor section. Some of us did not go there. I personally did not live there. I lived in the French concession for some other reasons. In any case, so when we arrived in Shanghai, we had a community. We had more or less over 20,000 people. So the Mir Yeshiva came, and they had a place where to learn, a small place, but they had found a place where they could daven, they could learn. And these smaller groups of yeshivas, such as Radiner or Kletzker or Kamenitzer, there were 10 or 20, or Telzer, 10, 20, or 30 of those. They also joined together with the Mir Yeshiva, and they learned in the same Besmedrash. But the Ribono Shel Olam had prepared something even better than that. About 10 years before we arrived to Japan, to Shanghai, there was a man called Hadun. He had no children. He was married, and we don't know his background about his family. Somehow the story is told that he had a dream. His father came to his cholim. He should open a shul, he should build a shul. And he built a shul, what I would describe nowadays as near Wall Street area. It was absolutely away from where the residential people, where the people were living residential life, was in the, what they call it, in the Bund. It's called BU, and the Bund section. There was the Wall Street area of Shanghai. Huge buildings, the stock exchange was there, the banks were there. And he built a shul for 300 people. And no one could understand what happened. He didn't have a minyan and never used the shul. So when the Mir Yeshiva arrived in Shanghai, somehow we got hold of that shul, and the Mir Yeshiva went to the shul, started and learned in the shul. It was a beautiful building, mamish prepared for the Mir Yeshiva. So the Storim Darkat Hashem, we don't know the Ribono Shel Olam, how he fed. There's a long story about this Mr. Hadun, how the father came to him in Cholim.
Were you yourself learning with the Mir boys at that time?
No. I was going to say. Am I on again?
Whenever you'd like to be.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So the Mir Yeshiva went, and together with all the other Talmidim, together with, from other yeshivas, they all went to study into that yeshiva. However, two other smaller yeshivas opened up in the, what they call in the section, the Hongqiu section, which was the poor section. One was Yeshivas Chachma Lublin, the Talmidim from the Lublin Yeshiva, and the other one was the Lublin of Lubavitch Yeshiva, Chabad. These two had a separate yeshiva. They took a small building. They only had 30, 40 Talmidim, so it wasn't a big problem. Not like the Mir Yeshiva would, together with the others, there were almost 300 already, so it's a completely different story. So they took a building, and they even slept over there in that building. They had only about between 30, 40 Talmidim. But apart from these groups, yeshiva, there were also Stambal Batim, who didn't go to yeshiva anymore. They were married. A lot of Rabbonim came, a very famous Rabbonim, Volkin, Zechor Yemos Olam, and so many, and came, and they had families already. They were married, so they had to live separately. And they also had to daven. Those who were from the Yeshiva Welt, they went to daven the Mir Yeshiva. And those who were Hasidic Welt, they davened in the Hasidic Yeshivas, either Lubavitch or Lublin. Except Amshon Rebbe, Zechor Yemos Olam, he lived by himself in the city, called in the French concession. And so Reb Chaim Shmulevich, Rosh Yeshiva of the Mir, he lived outside of this group. And things looked pretty normal. We tried to get visas to go to the United States, and I'm sure everything would have been arranged in due time, and some to Israel, and some of them left already. However, 3 months later, December 8th, 1941,
December 7th.
December 7th here, December 8th over there in Japan, in
So please
the
say
States.
that again. Please say it again, 'cause I interrupted.
Yeah, December 7th here. So there was the attack from the Japanese to Pearl Harbor, and everything stopped. No more communication, no more ships, no more other ways of emigrating. And of course, the American embassy was taken over, the British embassy. In fact, the Japanese took many of this, I say many because I don't know what percentage, probably most of the Sephardic community were taken to a camp because they had, at the time, most of them had British passports. Because Iraq, they came from Iraq originally in India, and there were British colonies at the time. So they all had British passports. At the time, they became enemies of the Japanese. So they were taken to camps. Not the kind of camps that we understand from the German camps. They were talking about big, beautiful building. In fact, I went to visit a friend of mine. It's a big building, but they lived restricted. They couldn't go on. So that happened later. So the whole thing started all over again having problems. In fact, the United States government prevented from sending money to so-called enemy territory. So even monies that were coming from Varazzolo, from Rav Kalmanovich for the Mir and so on, everything had to be stopped. They found some ways. Some money trickled down. They came through Sweden, was Rabbi Zuber there, or through Rabbi Jacobson, and some came through Switzerland. Dr. Kuhl, Zechor Yemos Olam, he was working in the Polish embassy, so some money, the Sternburgs and so on. So some money trickled down, but was not legal on the grants, on a larger scale, I would say, because the money really came mostly from the Joint. The Joint had to close down. So officially, everything would close down. And that became a serious problem. Fortunately, the dollar was very, very expensive at the time. One could live with very little. Perhaps I would say for $2, $3 you could live a week. So you didn't need so much money. But nevertheless, it became a problem. Somehow we managed to live on, and hoping soon we'll be able to immigrate, we'll go somewhere. Then came another problem. 2 years later, that is 1943, there was a lot of pressure from the Germans to the Japanese, to do something about the Jews. We don't know exactly the reason. We only know from what Marvin Takei, Robert Takei, wrote in his book, that the pressure from the Germans to put the Jews at least into a ghetto, so that all the Jews will be in one place. And the Japanese proclaimed that at a certain date in 1943, all the Jews who lived all over Shanghai, except the two communities, the Sephardi communities, which were mostly taken to British camps, and the Russian community who came here before 1937 to Shanghai, they were exempt from going to ghetto, because they had, at the time, they had Russian passports. And the Japanese government did not want to start up with the Russian government at the time. And they didn't want to start it with German government at the time. So they called all the refugees, I mean by the fact that those who had no particular passport, no citizenship, but even those who had Polish passports, also occupied by Germany already at the time. So everyone had to move into the ghetto, to that small section, that the poor section. Naturally was a big burden for everyone. Those who had already settled in the city, having apartments, they had to go to the ghetto. But the problem was, the ghetto was closed with wires around the ghetto, gates around the ghetto, built around it, and no one could go in, no one could get out without permission from the Japanese government. There was an office there asking for permission. Fortunately, we asked for permission for the Mir Yeshiva because, as I mentioned before, the shul was outside near, so-called like near Wall Street, which was away about 2-3 miles away from the ghetto. they got permission to go in the morning at 8 o'clock in the morning and come back before 7 or 6. And then this permission was taken away too, and they had to find a place where to learn in the ghetto. And that was a problem. Packed in about 25,000 Jews. And so, not everyone was in yeshiva, so it was a problem in Lechuas Parnos Zeh. They had to find Parnos one from the other. Even those people who had jobs outside, they couldn't go out so easily. Some of them asked for permission, perhaps professionals like medicals, doctors and others who worked in hospitals. They got some permission to go in the morning, come back at night. But it was a tremendous strain and a burden, and also very, very dangerous. We didn't know exactly what the purpose of putting the ghetto. There are historians who claim that the purpose of putting all the Jews in the ghetto, the Japanese wanted to put all the Jews on 2 or 3 ships, and supposedly sending them away on an island, but actually to sink them on the ocean. And there was another document found that they were going to build a crematorium about 30 miles away from Shanghai. And the Germans were pressuring them and to annihilate all the Jewish people. So we don't know. The end is the Ribono Shel Olam took care of us. And we stayed there until the war broke. The war was almost over in 1945. We stayed in the ghetto. Not alone, when the Americans came in and they started bombarding Shanghai, and many bombs fell not far away from the ghetto. They say some people got killed. I don't know exactly who went in, but it was mamish a miracle because there was ammunition, also some factories near there. At the end is, the Ribono Shel Olam helped us, and the war was over in 1945. August 8th, is it, or whatever, after the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So naturally everything was open, and like Rue de Moiseur, and was a tremendous a great Yom Tov. And you have to realize that during the time, while the yeshivas were in full swing, we had, of course, the Mashgiach, and Bechatzkel the Mashgiach, Levenstein, and he gave all kinds of divrei chizuk we should try and hold together. And Baruch Hashem, I must say that there was no chas v'sholem anything, anybody dying, especially from hunger or anything else. There were some cases, some people passed away, some of them natural, and some of them because there was a typhus at the time. And even a good friend of mine, a young fellow, young man, 21 years old, Talmud Yeshivas Chachmon Blin, got sick, and mamish before the war, 2 or 3 days passed away. There were some, but basically, Baruch Hashem, the entire Jewish community survived. And 1945, when the war was over, and everyone tried to get his own place, some of them immigrated to Israel. There was another problem, tried to get a visa certificate, as you know, was very restricted at the time. The British wouldn't let the Jews in there. And then others, most of us, all came to the United States. We got the visa, some of us as rabbis, some of us as students, some of us as teachers. Somehow we all managed to come to the United States. I'll stop here for a minute.
Yes.
I have to change.
That's a nice story. I'd like to hear it myself.
We're going to get you a date. Of a Rebbe that you would like to share with us, something he said or something about him. He was like the Rosh Yeshiva, is that not correct?
No, he was the Rebbe. Rosh Yeshiva, no. In Shanghai, the only Reb Chaim was Rosh Yeshiva, Chaim Shmulevich. And I mean, they both him well, and Rabbi Chaskel used to do too. There was no organization. Everything looked so temporary, waiting from day to day. You know, we listen to the news, and according to the news, the world's going to be over. There's not. Let me just ask me a few, maybe I'll find what other points you brought out.
Could you tell us a statement about the contribution of the young men who learned in Shanghai later on in the world?
Yeah, that's a good
an important
point.
statement to say that they went to Chicago, New York, and they.
Of course. I just want to cover. Okay, this one. What? Anything else
Yeah,
that
if
I
you have any
mentioned?
specific memories about
Emphasize a great deal on the subject. I emphasize the important, and I mentioned how every yeshiva has someone who came originally from Shanghai, like even Yeshiva University, Shimon Rom, you had Rav Gerelik and came David Lipschitz and all these big yeshivas, and I don't have to talk about Rabban Kotler, and then you have in Israel, you have every yeshiva in the country here. You have someone either directly or indirect, or a descendant of someone who came from Shanghai. This is, I always talk about that subject. Of course, it's very, the contribution they get. The Beis Talmud, what the Beis Talmud did over here. I mean, they were, to talk about the Beis Talmud himself, talk about the Mir Yeshiva. They were not, we speak about the Mir Yeshiva, we're talking about like, yeshiva, let's say, Ner Yisrael Yeshiva. You can't compare. Here they were going ador, they were lumdim. My Malin of Shmucharkev, we talk about people, Pekarsky, I mean, talking about each by himself. I'm talking about Shivas Chachmul Blin, just off the record. Abu Mata Hirschberg. He was, I would say, maybe 23 years old, 22, 23 years old. He gave out 2 Sforim, Machshavas HaKodesh, Aleph and Beis, and Kutchim. He wrote this when he was 17 years old. Motride Luba. He gave out a sefer. It's called Melchames Yehuda on Kutchim. Now he was sitting down in Shanghai, in Vilna, typewriting. I know how we had a Yiddish typewriter time. How old was he? 19 years old, 20 years old. Gave out a sefer from Kutchim. Today you look at it, I mean, and then Moshe Rottenberg. I mean, talking about, they knew Shas by heart. Rav Hirschsprung, I'd have to tell you. I mean, the man was the greatest Goin in the world. This was the these were Talmidim. In the yeshiva, and how many, I mean, Mendel Kaplan, I'm talking about, Bochum, Mir Yeshiva, one by one, Meshgichim, Rosh Yeshivas, and we're going out there, my Malin, and I mentioned it before, I'm talking, it's hard to explain to a yeshiva what the Mir Yeshiva was in Shanghai. You compare Mir Yeshiva and even with all due respect, even to Chaim Berlin or the other one. I have kids, I have grandchildren learn. It's different. I can't even, there's nothing to explain that to them. You know what I mean? You can't explain that. At Shabbos I learned with him, so grandson, learn, nice boy. What do you learn? You learn Exubis. Okay, that's the Perik. You knew very well. Went through.
Who are you speaking about now?
I'm at a grandson. I'm not speaking about him.
Oh.
You have me on the tape?
Yeah.
Oh my God! I didn't know this.
So we won't use it.
No, you can use it. I'm talking about you can't use this here because you can't use it. You can't talk even if they go in their land. The whole.
So would you like to make? So why don't you make a statement?
Yeah, I can say that. Yeah.
The generation today doesn't know. The boys and girls that we're going to be showing this to, they don't know who were the people from the Mir Yeshiva. They don't know their contribution that they made. It's important to say that these people went out.
You have them on the tape?
Yes,
Yeah, we're ready to go.
Yeah. See, before we speak about the Mir Yeshiva and they left for the United States and Israel, we have to realize that at that time the Mir Yeshiva consisted of Mamish Goin Ador. There's not one, I can't say one, but very few yeshivas in the world today who don't have the Nico, who don't have either directly one of the Talmidim Mir Yeshiva from that period, or the children or the grandchildren even. Each one of them, each Talmud the Mir Yeshiva was a Goin Olam at the time. The Beis Talmud was over here, and we have we're talking about Talmidim, Shmuel Charkiv, Ableibel Malin, we're talking about Pekarski. We took each one of them was mamish going and learning. Even if you come to the Chassidish Yeshivas Chachma Lebrin, we speak of Rav Hirschberg. Rav Mordechai Hirschberg was the chief rabbi of Mexico. He was only 17, 18 years old when he wrote Sforim Machshavas HaKodesh on Kochim, or Mordechai de Lubat, who was considered one of the greatest masmid in Shivas Chachma Lebrin. They say he never went to sleep. He only slept on a bench the whole week. Only Friday night went to sleep. He wrote a sefer Malchemes Yehuda on Kochim, and Moshe Rottenberg, and all these. Rav Hirschberg, one of the greatest goyim even in our time, the Rav Roshi from Montreal. These people who knew Shas by heart, such Gedol Ador. And let me say another word. We're speaking about the girls. Who were the teachers of the Beis Yaakov in Shanghai? They were women who came originally from Europe, from Poland particularly. Many of them Talmidas from Sora Shanir. And they brought along the Yerushalayim in them. They brought along the past history of the Polish, the education of the Beis Yaakovs in Europe was a completely. I know that today also, of course, the girls of Beis Yaakov, my own wife was Talmida Beis Yaakov. I know the great. But if we think of the door of the previous door from before, each one of them could be a Rosh Yeshiva. Each Talmud from the yeshivas could be a great Rosh Yeshiva, and they are. They are. If you come even Yeshiva University, you have a Chaim Ram, we had Rab Shimon Ram the Besaker, Rab Shimon Besaker was his name. You have David Lifshitz, you have Rav Gerelik, and you have all these Rosh Yeshivas who came from Shanghai, from Japan, from the Sugahara visas. And every yeshiva, in RJJ, Rav Meir Pantel, you had in Philadelphia, Mendel Kaplan, all the Goyin Ador, Mamish. By those days, they were Talmidim of the Mira Yeshiva. And the influence they had, and not speaking about Eretz Yisrael, Chaim Shmulevich, Mira Yeshiva, Kanai today 4,000 or 5,000 Talmidim Hashem, and all these rabbis in Mashgichim, Rabbi Chaskel, Rabbi Chaskel Levinson was the Mashgich in Ponyevish Yeshiva. To think that we spend a few years under the auspices or under the influence and to listen to those Goinim, somehow they left an indelible mark on all of us. So, and we are. Perhaps we have to thank the Rabbeinu Shalom, even though we suffered a few years, but we had a chance to get the unika from those people, both the boys and the girls and the Beis Yaakov and the yeshivas and all that. You know very well that in every yeshiva you go, you're speaking, mentioning Rabban Kotler, who can speak about what he did, what he accomplished in his life. And who knows if there would not have been a Mr. Sugahara, a Japanese man, if he would not have gotten that visa, what would have been today in Lakewood? We don't know. We can't possibly imagine what the world would have been today without this one or two people, the Goyim, that what they did for the Jewish, for our Jewish world. It is impossible to describe them. So we have to be, in a way, Gedoyle Masad Hashem, we don't know. The Baruch Shem does his work, and we just follow his ways. And perhaps he sent us over there for that particular reason, to die to bring Yiddishkeit. And then, on a personal note, we have to realize, we're speaking about, there were 2,000 visas given by this Japanese man, Mr. Sugahara. I got the visa myself, one person. I got married, Baruch Hashem. I have 5 married children, Baruch Hashem. I have, Baruch Hashem, 28 grandchildren and some great-grandchildren. Think of one person, how many Jewish people, how many nefushes are alive today. So there's no words enough for us to thank the Rabbeinu Shalom for what he did. Now, what he did, not only physically he saved our people, and what he did, how much Ruchnis is today in the world, thanks to the fact that we had those Gedolei Ador, those days that kept us aligned, kept Yeshiva in line, and bless the world with such Gedolei Ador coming from the Mir Yeshiva and from the Beis Yaakov, and to thank Rav Ashkenazi, who was the Rav in Shanghai, in Mesiras Nefesh, what he did with him, with mikvahs and Talmud Torahs and Beis Yaakovs, and providing us both physically, Gashmis and Ruchnis. So we thank the Rebbeinu Shalom, B'chol Eis V'chol Shor, and everything that he has done to us. And we hope, Mi'at Hashem, we should continue to lead our children. We should continue to have nachas from our families. So we should continue to go in the same derech Hashem, and the derech that our Gedolim, our Rebbes, our Rosh Yeshivas, and our Beis Yaakov teachers have taught us to follow the ways of Hashem and Yerushalayim, and I may say, my personal note, even Hasidus, that we continue to live in that difficult time. We didn't forget our personal heritage that came from home. And I just want to close one note, a very important note. We have spoken about the savior of 2,100 people, with hundreds of thousands of people living today. But I think we shouldn't forget that we paid a very high price for that. We have to realize that 90% or more, 95% of the group of the 2,000 or the Mir Yeshiva, they were all young boys, and some of the girls were saved. But what happened to the families? All of them left the families behind. We can't forget that it was a minute saving. I'm personal, from my personal life, and you had my young parents and 3 sisters and 2 brothers and hundreds of members of the family, and nobody survived. So the Rebbeinu Shalom gave us a savior. I survived. And you know, thinking the Pusik Vayeru, you say, L'man tesapeh shmi b'chol olam, I think it says, b'chol oretz. You see, sometimes perhaps we remain here because it's our obligation to tell the world we were saved. It's wonderful we were saved. But look what we left behind. How many hundreds of thousands of people. You realize that out of the 2,000 people, everyone had a family, had parents, had brothers, had sisters, had uncles, had aunts, had grandparents, and so all this was never left behind. We should never forget for a moment that even though we were saved, but we paid a very high price for our saving. Yep.
Thank you very much.
I think this was important to say.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was very important.
Because we go away from a beautiful story, and it's a nice story, but a nice story.